When the Spaniards conquered Mexico, they took for themselves everything within reach, just as all invaders have always done. The supply of gold and precious stones comes to an end. But there is one form of wealth that never ends, the land itself. So the conquerors claimed ownership of all the land in Mexico, and they built strong-walled castles to enforce their claims. It was the only system of social life they had ever known. Landlords on top and serfs at the bottom, a system known as feudalism, and they tried to copy it just as closely as the conditions of the New World would permit. They set out to establish their rule not only over the land, but over every living thing on it. Land is worth nothing to an owner unless there is labor to work it into wealth. This also was the way the feudal system operated in Europe. To hold down the Indian serfs, the landlords surrounded themselves with armed guards, preferably mestizos, men of mixed Indian and Spanish blood, who were thus put into a slightly favored social position midway between the two hostile races from which they themselves had sprung. Just above the mestizos were the Creoles, American-born overseers and minor officials. Though of Spanish blood, they were subordinate to the so-called Peninsula Spaniards who ruled in the name of the Spanish king. The broad base of this entire economic system was the peon, the all but enslaved native who was forced to live and work under guard for the groups who had set themselves up above him. At dawn, the peons were made to assemble in the patio to be assigned their daily tasks. As they waited, with seemingly endless patience and resignation, they lifted their voices in the old, old chant of their ancestors in honor of the rising sun. That sun was their great free God, the all-powerful God of the ancient free native peoples, and little did the rulers suspect that the daily hymn, apparently so meaningless and traditional, could be serving to keep alive the smoldering spark of freedom. Dawn after dawn, day after day, year after year, the peons assembled. They voiced their chant and went forth under the shadow of the guns of their watchful guards out into the baking hot fields to their endless labors. Hard, endless, monotonous labor was their lot, the barest subsistence to hold body and soul together, their reward. The maguey yields pulque, and pulque yields gold for the masters to spend. Yes, and alcohol, too, for the guards to get drunk on. When a peon couple wanted to marry, and had the consent of the bride's parents, they still had to obtain the permission of the master, for a marriage license was expensive to the peon, and always profitable to his landlord. Legally, the peons were never slaves, but they were held under such heavy obligations that they could never escape. On such occasions, the landlord was generally quite genial, and why not? Marriage meant heavy fees for the peon to work out, and eventually, children would be born to become new peons. The landlords were not always so genial. Unrestrained ill treatment was the common lot of the peons, and there was no protection to turn to anywhere against the brutality of the guards and the cruel demands of the masters. When suffering went beyond all human endurance, a desperate, almost hopeless effort was made to escape. Such individual breaks for freedom were seldom successful, and in any case, they were never socially decisive. The story of the suffering and oppression of the peons is eloquently told in the heroic murals painted by the great Mexican artist Diego Rivera on the walls of the Ministry of Education. The harsh rule of the Spanish conquerors is shown to have been continued by their descendants, the great landlords who could not realize even then that historically their whole system of feudal power was on its way out. At the end of the 18th century, the British colonies to the north had won their independence, and at the beginning of the 19th century, 9 new republics were born in South America out of what had been Spanish colonies just like Mexico. Mexico also did not escape the winds of freedom that swept the world. While the Creoles dreamed of independence as a road for their ambitions, the peons hoped only to get their land back, for with land comes freedom. In 1810, the War of Independence was launched, chiefly by 2 priests of Indian blood. In the north, Father Hidalgo raised the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe as his battle flag and proclaimed land and freedom as his motto. Morelos in the south fought for the same aim. Both were defeated and executed, yet their loyal lieutenants only a few years later became the first and second presidents of the Mexican Republic. But it takes more than a constitution to change a feudal land into a modern republic. The freedom-loving peoples were faced by armies from Spain, Britain, and France that threatened the new nation. When conditions became unbearable, the people rose in a long struggle for reform under the leadership of Benito Juarez. He was a full-blooded Zapotec Indian. In many ways, his life and role was like that of Abraham Lincoln. But alas, Juarez died too soon. His place was seized by Porfirio Diaz, one of his former lieutenants, and for over 30 years the interests of the big landlords and the foreign investors received every advantage. Still more land was taken from the natives in order to force them to go to work for wages lower than they had been getting 100 years before, when Father Hidalgo launched the War of Independence. Despite all oppression, the forces that aimed to make Mexico a modern nation and to bring happiness and prosperity to the bulk of its people grew stronger and bolder. Their demands were simple: no more dictatorship, land for the peon, legal protection for labor, Mexico for the Mexicans. Just about 100 years after Father Hidalgo's death, President Diaz was driven out of Mexico, and the country's progress toward freedom was resumed. A new order of things was written by force into the Constitution of 1917, and ever since then Mexican history has been a series of social struggles in its interpretation and enforcement. The great masses of the Mexican people remain definitely on the march. Poorly armed and often poorly organized, they stormed the strongholds of reaction on every field, heedless of cost or sacrifice. Victory at last. But with victory came a lot of new problems to solve. Dividing up land among small farmers alone is no complete answer. Large farms still have to be run on a large scale. The work is still hot and hard, but the guards and the guns are gone, and the weddings and fiestas and other enjoyments are now arranged as the peons themselves decide, without first begging the haciendados' permission. No wonder that their little band seems to play a livelier tune than it did in the old days. Yes, the work is still hot and hard, but the cattle and tools are now their own. The land is their own, their very own, their land and their freedom.